Welcome. Welcome to week 2 of Pssl 6240, Political Violence and Terrorism, here at George Washington Homeland Security program. I hope you had a good intro week, and for most of you, I hope you're now familiar with the course outline, the software that's used, as well as the online platform. And I also want to welcome any new students we might have had in the last week or so. I think one or two more added, so I want to welcome you to the course as well. So announcements, Adobe Connect session, as I mentioned in the earlier 26th January, that's a Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As I mentioned earlier, it is required if you're going to be briefing, but not required if you're not going to be briefing. But that's good office hours if you want to talk about paper stuff, if you want to talk about the course in general or anything else. The briefing, I'll give more guidance on it early this week, but I want to mention that about 20 to 25 minutes should be the briefing in total. And again, it'll be based on the questions that were assigned for the week 3 assignment. So 26 January, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Paper 1 is due on 29 January 2016 at 11:59 p.m. So those are the two big dates coming up, and make sure that you have the proper, or just to make sure that you've allocated time to hand in your first official assignment. Keep up the effort. The effort, sometimes in this course, people decide, they put in a lot of effort at the beginning, and then the effort goes away as the course goes on. Please don't lose that enthusiasm. Try and keep it up for the rest of this course, as well as the rest of the courses you have in this program. So I like what I've seen so far, but again, please put on the same level of effort. The videos that I mentioned are online, and I should have probably mentioned that earlier. Might violate, some copyright, but next week you're going to be watching One Day in September. That documentary is on YouTube. The following week, you're going to be watching The Road to 9/11. That documentary is on YouTube. The following is a movie about Dirty War. That movie is on YouTube. So if you haven't ordered the DVDs yet, you can watch them on YouTube as well right now. And if you haven't ordered, please don't, so you can watch them for free. And then finally, current events. As I mentioned in the intro lecture, what goes on outside affects what happens inside this classroom. This isn't a pure academic course where we're talking about esoteric topics. We're talking about things that unfold in the real world as we're talking. And currently there is now legislation just proposed by the new Congress to make the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. And this goes right into what we're going to talk about in week 2. So there's two things to determine. One, are the actions of the Muslim Brotherhood actually reach to the level of a terrorist group? And two, one of the laws is we're going to sanction anyone's associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. What does that mean? What does being associated with the Muslim Brotherhood mean? That you have to delineate that definition of what is association with a lot more clarity. Was the guy who shot up that place in Fort Lauderdale, who had watched 1 or 2 ISIS videos, was he associated with ISIS? If I passively view right-wing extremism on YouTube or other social media, am I now associated with right-wing extremism? Is the Dylan Roof, the person now on death row in South Carolina, he was definitely a lone wolf, but he was inspired by right-wing extremists or neo-Nazi extremists. Can I now put all of those groups in a terrorist in the terrorism camp? Those questions are what your second paper is going to be about, and more importantly, they impact from a legal and moral perspective what is terrorism, what crosses the threshold of terrorism. So again, what happens in the outside, in the real world, definitely impacts what goes on in the classroom. So going back to week 1, reviewing, is terrorism an existential threat? I don't think anybody said it was an existential threat. And all of you have contradicted what numerous politicians and media outlets have said. They've said terrorism is an existential threat. It impacts your way of life. I've heard other people say for ISIS, it's either them or us. That's a pretty profound statement, but I don't think anybody here agreed with that. And a lot of you alluded to the psychological impact and whether we do it to ourselves, which is the second point, self-inflicted. Terrorism, whether it's in Nice, when someone drives a truck in a crowded field or opens fire in a club, as in Orlando, that has more of a psychological impact than the drip, drip, drip deaths caused by heart disease or vehicular accidents or any of the number of other policy issues that were discussed in the Atlantic article. So again, the psychological impact, right or wrong, fair or not, whether we're self-inflicting it or not, is what makes terrorism probably more of a threat, even though the casualty rates are close to 0.0001%. You have to ask, what can impact our way of life? I mentioned in the video or in the online lecture the Soviet Union threat during the Cold War. That impacted our way of life because they had thousands of nuclear weapons. If you're in Mosul right now, ISIS is definitely impacting your way of life, your ability to carry out your day-to-day situation. But does ISIL impact our way of life here? Or do we let it impact our way of life? Unless you're a soldier who's deploying to Iraq, or you travel a lot and you have to go through TSA, does it really affect your day-to-day life? The ability to pursue your day-to-day, whatever activities there are. And then finally, I brought this up in the discussion, what's in our control? A lot of those other policy issues, whether it's heart disease or vehicular accidents, you can control. You can eat healthier. If you're in a vehicle, you can drive a safer car or drive the speed limit or get one of those, all those fancy cameras and the beeps and things that go off when you're in close proximity to another car that are much safer. You can control that. Terrorism, you can't control. Unless you want to never want to be in a crowded area or never want to go to the mall or never fly on an airplane, those variables you can't really control. It's random. I guess you can live in a rural area, and we'll talk about that in detail in a second. But other than that, if you live in a semi-urban area or you fly a plane or you travel on a plane or are in a crowd of any sorts, you can't control it. And that might be one of the psychological issues with what separates it from all those other policy issues. So that wraps up kind of the week one. I just want to say this is kind of a scene setter piece. You will not be tested on existential threat, but it is kind of a theme that weaves its way through all the topics discussed for the remainder of the course. So week two preview. This is we're going to talk about terrorism history for the first part of week two, and that's generally on the 4 waves. And what I mentioned in the first week of the course was that whether it's ISIS or Al-Qaeda, people have said it's unprecedented, that this has never seen anything like that in history. And that's not true. There's patterns in groups in terrorist groups throughout the years. And one of the key things a terrorist group has to do is they have to get their message out. They have to communicate with a wide audience. And that is kind of a commonality for all terrorist groups. What you see on the top there is the Irgun, and we're going to talk about that in detail. And that is the Israeli, how the Israeli state was formed by terrorist activity by the Irgun. And what you see there is the Irgun wanted to expel the British from their territories, and they hung 2 British soldiers, and that's what you see there. And they were using the technology of the day, which was teletype video or teletype photography, which is something new in 1947, 1948, where you can transmit a picture instantaneously. And the Israelis knew that, And they wanted to use this brutal picture to send a message. It was the YouTube of the day. And that's how the Israelis got their message across, and that as an example. What you see in the middle is Black September, and you'll see this more in detail in One Day in September, the documentary. But that is, this was the 1972 Munich Olympic attack. And what Black September knew was that the Munich 1972 games were the first time that you had 24-hour live TV coverage. And they knew that was the first main world event that would be broadcast throughout the world. And they knew that was the forum to get their message across. And they did it with brutality, but they did it very effectively. And then the last piece, I think everyone's aware of ISIS and the beheading videos. Those are, their brutality, but they're also serving an advantage to ISIS. It gives them worldwide message. It gets them page clicks. It gets them their social media emphasis just by this video, because they know if you behead someone on YouTube, you're going to get massive amounts of publicity. I hate to sound crude, and this is very insensitive, but ISIS operates in the same way as Kim Kardashian does when she wants to, whatever her latest stunt is, to get more publicity. The beheadings serve the same purpose. They're obviously a lot more brutal, and I don't mean to play them down, but they serve the same purpose of trying to get worldwide attention and trying to get massive publicity to their cause. So again, the patterns that you see, and in this is communications, or how terrorist groups get their message out. The technology changes, obviously, but the desire to do so doesn't change. So the week 2, again, the readings, as I mentioned, just a couple of the readings, the Hoffman, chapter 1 through 4, Inside Terrorism. You should all have that book. If you don't have it now, please download it on Kindle or iPad. The 4 Waves of Terrorism, you can get that article online, and that's probably a very, very succinct package of the history of terrorism, starting in the World War I time frame to the to the current, right before the rise of ISIS. So the 4 Waves, again, is probably the most succinct history. One Day in September, great documentary. Definitely the best terrorism documentary out there, and I'd argue one of the best documentaries, period, out there. It's online, so you can watch it on YouTube. It's about the 1972 Olympic Games. And as you're watching it, think about, again, the message, how Black September, the terrorist group, used the worldwide media to distribute its message worldwide. Also look at how incompetent the German military was in trying to stop something like a terrorist attack. And I hope by being in this program, you do not want to replicate that level of incompetence, or you want, whatever position you are in the Homeland Security or in police, that you want to make sure that you do the opposite of what you see in that documentary. But fantastic documentary. Just a little bit of warning, there's violence in it, so it's not necessarily the most appropriate family-friendly documentary out there. And then finally, the Vox article, that will lead you into the definitions of terrorism piece. And the Vox article discusses, is the Orlando shooter back over this past summer, should he be considered a terrorist because of his association with ISIS? So the lectures and the discussion sections, Terrorism History Part 1, again, you're going to look at the 4 waves of terrorism and analyze that as far as your discussion section. And then you listen to the lecture, well, first read about the Hoffman and the 4 waves of terrorism, listen to the lecture, and then participate in the discussion section that covers that part. And then the second lecture and discussion section is my favorite. What is terrorism? What isn't terrorism? And that, I think, is critical. As I mentioned earlier, we have to have a good definition of terrorism. We have to have a good definition of terrorism because we get to do things to terrorists that we don't get to do to other people who commit crimes. We get to put a no-fly list. That is something we don't do for any other criminal activity. But when you think about it, a bureaucrat in our government, without due process, can just say, you cannot fly on any airplane. You will go into more restrictive screening. That's actually pretty unique, and that only occurs for terrorists. That's the only criminal activity. If we want to have extradition treaties with terrorists, we have to have a very common definition. Right now in Turkey, they want to, they're claiming that someone who's in Pennsylvania is responsible for terrorist activity. So you have to define, if we want to, and I don't think we should, but if we want to extradite him, or if Turkey wants him extradited, we have to have a common definition of terrorism between us and Turkey. Our soon-to-be president has said he wants to kill terrorist families. If you're going to do that, you better have a very clear definition of terrorism that can be agreed upon in our community and the international community as well. So we're going to explore that in depth. Your discussion is going to be defining certain incidents or certain groups as terrorism or not. And when you're doing that, please get into the variables or the certain factors that say, okay, this is an act of terrorism because of A, B, C, D, and E. So the more you think about that discussion, the more effort you put into it, the better your paper will be. And I'll give you more guidance on the paper in the next YouTube lecture. So with that being said, I look forward to week 2. And if there's questions or issues, please don't hesitate to contact me.